Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Industrial Real Estate Show. I am pleased to be joined by David Greek from Greek Real Estate Partners, based out in New Jersey, but also have properties in Philadelphia. There's one other one as well. We'll dig into that. Talking all things industrial real estate. We're going to nerd out about it. Very excited to start this off with David. David, thanks so much for joining me on the show.
Thanks so much for having me. Excited to have this conversation.
What market was I missing? Your New Jersey, Philadelphia?
So the bulk of our portfolio is concentrated in New Jersey and Eastern PA. We have a few investments outside. We have one in Chicago, one in Florida, and a few more we're working on in Florida. And recently we have made an effort to expand our presence outside of this area, particularly in the Southeast. We've recently been licensed as general contractors, basically in every state east of the Mississippi. So we're actively pursuing new construction work down in the Southeast and bidding on quite a bit of work from some other developers down there.
How big is Greek? What does your portfolio consist of, or I know you do a lot of development, a lot in the ownership and the asset management. What can you tell me about Greek?
Greek is a complicated company. We are a full service real estate group. So we have a little bit of everything under the roof here. I mentioned our contracting division. That's really how the company started in the 1930s. My grandfather started out as a contractor. His first job was very, very small, $500 porch in someone's backyard. He scaled up through the 40s and eventually, had enough capital to go buy some property for himself and develop himself. My father, joined the company after a short stint in the Army in the 60s and moved us down from Bergen County to where we are today in East Brunswick, and really focused the company's development on industrial. So ever since about 1970, we have been a pure play industrial development management leasing shop. And we do everything under this roof. So we self-perform our own builds. We also have our a division dedicated to managing our diligence and entitlement processes. Once the buildings are completed, we have a management division that helps do the asset and property management. And we also have an internal brokerage that helps lease a number of the assets we manage, but not all of them. The portfolio right now, we manage about 23 million square feet. Again, most of that's highly concentrated in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And, we manage not just for our own portfolio, but on behalf of, our investors and particularly our institutional relationships. So a couple very large institutional owners in New Jersey use Greek Real Estate Partners as their managing agent in the state. We're a pretty unique business in the fact that we don't have a fund or a programmatic equity relationship, but we are a very institutional focused shop in terms of how we capitalize deals. So almost, I'd say about 70 to 80% of the deals that we close on are with an LP partner and we're in the GP role. But we kind of deliberately maintain some flexibility on how we capitalize deals. So the last, year and a half, 2 years, the institutional equity for spec development was very, very thin. And so we've actually taken a lot on our own balance sheet over the last 2 years to stay active. We still very much believe in development, particularly in our home market of New Jersey. So we have multiple ways to kind of approach investments and capitalize investments. And we think that's somewhat of an advantage in times like these.
With it being a family business, going back to your grandfather doing a $500 porch, that's a crazy origin story. Was it always in the cards for you to get into the family business, or how did you decide that industrial real estate was the path that you were going to take?
Oh, that's complicated. So I'm actually the youngest of 4 kids that my father had. So, the joke I kind of make is I'm either the smartest or the dumbest of the 4, because none of my older siblings had really any interest in getting involved with the business. I think I knew from a relatively young age, in my house growing up, industrial real estate was the dinner conversation. I know that sounds odd to most people, but we talked about construction, we talked about leasing, we talked about our tenants and what they did, and that was, just part of the air I breathed growing up, and I enjoyed it. I really found it interesting. I found what my father did in particular as a developer really, really fascinating. I was always interested in business and economics. Um, I went to Georgetown University from high school and was focused more on the finance side of things, and thought I might want to go to Wall Street originally. I got a little taste of that through a summer internship and said, not for me. And was able to get some work experience outside of Greek Real Estate Partners while I was in university that gave me some exposure to what it's like to invest in real estate, what it's like to analyze real estate. And I honestly, that's really where I fell in love with it. I had the background of, the family dinner time conversations, but once it got into, analyzing the numbers, meeting the people, really understanding what goes into making a deal, that's where I started to get very passionate. And when I graduated, my father was, in his late 70s at that time. And he kind of approached me and said, if you want to learn from me, there's a pretty limited window for you to do that. So I decided to go straight from graduating Georgetown straight into the family firm, which was daunting. It was taking a big leap of faith on both the confidence in myself, as well as confidence that I could work through the complexities of a family business without really much work experience at all. Um, in retrospect, I think it's one of the better, probably the best career decision that I've made. Um, I like to learn. I like to get my hands dirty, and really get involved in things. And joining up with my father early on allowed me to do that. Allowed me to be in an environment where I was permitted to make some pretty big mistakes early on. But I was permitted to make them and learn from them, and really get that hands-on experience. Um, and at the same time, you know, become much closer with my father in understanding his world a little bit better. And I think that was a little bit surprising to me. Is I was fearful when I joined the family company that it would erode the personal relationship between me and my dad, which was very good. Um, it hasn't. It's actually made us much closer because he describes this business as his second wife, his unborn son. He cares very much about it. And so being able to work with him closely, while he was still very much involved in the day to day, watching how he made decisions, watching how he interacted with his staff and with his partners, I don't think I could have got a better teacher, or got a better kind of front row seat to see how he did it. And I do things very differently than he does, but um, having that foundation of knowing, who he was and how the market saw him and how he interacted with people, I think has made me much better, and much more prepared to take on that role than I would have if I had gone to, say, I don't know, some other shop early in my career and tried to come back to the family later.
Yeah, that's a very cool story. And to think that it's a third generation of family business. Your grandfather was obviously very passionate about it. Your father's still passionate about it, and you're the third one to come in. And it is always interesting too that if you were the only son, would you have just been shoehorned into that as a legacy of having to do it just because it's either that or sell it to private equity? But you having the passion for it as well is having three generations of past passionate real estate entrepreneurs is very cool. What when did you get in? Like when did you join the company after Georgetown?
I joined in late 2013, so I've been here about 13 years. I kind of tell people I have about 10 years of work experience before that, just from sitting around the dinner table with my father. The reality is, I've been in the industry, a little over a decade now, My father is still involved with the business. He has handed over a lot of the day-to-day operations to both myself and a number of other operating partners that we have here. So he's less involved, although he's still very active. His mind is extremely sharp, and we still rely on him for a lot of advice. And he still gives fantastic advice, although I don't always agree with it.
You can tell the true real estate junkies by the ones that just never retire because they can't. It's just it. Not only is it something that they have to do it. They like to do it, but they have to do it. There's no such thing as retirement because they'll always be checking market reports. They'll always be looking to see what construction costs are. It's just that the mind of a successful real estate operator never stops. It's perpetual. The reason I asked on the timing is I think that's interesting in getting in 2013. Uh, Industrial real estate wasn't popular back then. That's the 13 years ago or so now. Like it was an abstract thought where if someone mentioned industrial real estate, people had a fuzzy idea on what it was, but it certainly wasn't popular. Now, going through the pandemic and to where we are now, it's the buzzword. Tons of institutional capital chasing it. It's the darling of the industry. It's almost gone from being the unthought of, unsexy asset class now being the trophy asset where people want to get into industrial and people are learning about it. What's changed? And you could even frame this going back when you were at the dining room table with your family. What have you seen change being in front row in the driver's seat from 2013 or before to where industrial is today?
It's such a big change. And I think folks like my father that have been in the industry since the 70s are still having a hard time adjusting to that new reality that, as you said, industrial real estate wasn't exactly popular. It wasn't seen as a high growth asset class for a very long time. It was considered a small part of the institutional investment universe, but a small part. It certainly never in my father's time running this company, it never got to the point where it was a preferred asset class from an investment perspective. But very quickly after I started work, we could tell it was heading in that direction. I mentioned that we have some strong institutional partners, so we do have a pretty good insight into kind of how the herd mentality of the institutions is looking. I think by 2015, 2016, there were some very good signs that this was, the view on Wall Street from the big investors was changing. Industrial, there were these large secular trends that a lot of people were talking about, particularly e-commerce, that was really catching the attention of the investment class. And industrial was kind of the low-hanging, obvious benefactor from some of the major changes in the way that people were consuming goods. Um, but you mentioned COVID, and that is really the gasoline that got poured on that fire. Um, when the pandemic struck, the first 2-3 months were absolute chaos for everybody, but particularly in the logistics industry. Um, the rules weren't clear. Um, the disease vectors weren't clear. Like there was just a lot of confusion for the first 2 months. But after that, I think it became pretty obvious to most of the industry that the only choice for continuing society in general would be to pivot almost all consumption online. And that really poured rocket fuel on the leasing environment and industrial in late 2020 through 2023, where you just had record amounts of leasing. The velocity was absolutely nuts. I mean, we had some very, very large leases with Fortune 50 companies that start to finish got signed in 30 days. And that just, kind of unheard of in the industrial world to move that quickly on that size lease. So they were strange times for a lot of different reasons, but very beneficial to our business, very beneficial to the values of the real estate that we own and manage. Um, and while I think, we've come down from those peaks in some ways, um, industrial, if you ask anyone in the investment community right now, is either the number one or number two most attractive investment property type. It's kind of bounced back and forth between multifamily and industrial for the past 2 years, but almost everybody that is deploying capital today says that is the areas they're targeting. And particularly for, where we're located in New Jersey, this is a target market for almost everybody. So while we have seen a pretty significant slowdown in the leasing velocity over the last 2 years, there's still quite a bit of institutional capital sitting on the sidelines that's waiting for the right opportunity to buy, especially in markets that are as supply constrained as New Jersey is.
Well said. Speaking on the development side, so as we went through the cycle, massive ramp up from 2020 to 2022, 2023, interest rates start rising, general pullback. General sentiment, I'd say, is that we were overbuilt in a lot of markets. New Jersey might have been exempt. You can speak to that specifically, but in a lot of markets, like at Dallas or in an inland market where they added 50, 70, 100 million square feet to the inventory, they're chewing through that very slowly right now because it was overbuilt in a lot of these markets. What were you seeing in a coastal market like New Jersey or presumably other markets? Did you see the same overbuilding mentality? And how would you, I guess what I'm ultimately trying to get to is what would you say the market is today? And we're in March 2026, having gone through a absolutely ridiculous and unpredictable market of crazy growth, demand drivers caused by the pandemic, to an overbuild in a lot of markets, to interest rates going up and affecting the affordability and even the desire to want to build. So we've seen a pullback in development. Where does that all put us where we are today, March 2026?
Let me start from today and then work backwards as odd as that sounds. Today we're getting to a point of better balance in the market. Our vacancy rate has been coming down. It's been stubbornly high, but vacancy rate is coming down. The available sublease market has come down very consistently over the last 18 months. So the health of the market today looks much, much better than it did a year ago. But I've been kind of thinking of and referring to the last 2 years as the COVID hangover, because as you said, there was a frenzy of tenant activity and in response, a frenzy of development activity really across the entire country. Um, and markets where, there was available land and there was kind of low barriers to entry, almost all those markets did get overbuilt, at least in the short term. I think I've been somewhat surprised by markets like Dallas that, had one of the biggest development pipelines in the entire country back in 2023. When I looked at that market back then, it was pretty scary from a development perspective. How is all this space going to get leased when we know that tenants are taking a step back from leasing and there's a lot of sublease space coming on? Remarkably, Dallas has stayed somewhat healthy, but other markets like the Inland Empire, where you do have some barriers to entry, but the trends over the last 5 years have been really to push inward, inland in the Inland Empire. The locations being built today are not quite as prime as the locations being built in the Inland Empire 6-7 years ago. That vacancy rate seems extremely stubborn, and like there is a lot of excess space out there that is going to take some time to absorb. We, I think one of the nice parts about being a developer in New Jersey, there's a lot of bad parts to it, trust me, but one of the nice parts is the barriers to entry are extremely high here. It's not just that we don't have a lot of land and that we're the densest populated state in the nation. That is certainly part of it. The rules and regulations and the political environment, add on top of that other complexities to developing here. So this has been getting worse, not better, in the state of New Jersey for the last 10 years. We have, when we start to entitle a site, we are roughly anticipating a minimum of 2 years, kind of maximum of 5 or 6 years to get through that government approval process. And
Wow.
that's just it's a very, very long runway for, particularly for industrial, which really only takes about 12 months to build, start to finish. So if you need to spend, anywhere from 3 to 5 years prepping a project to get to the 12-month build, it just, it makes those investments much, much more challenging. And um, it also makes New Jersey's ability to respond to spikes in demand a lot less. And that's one of the benefits of living in a state where it's really hard to do business. When we experienced the spike in leasing in early 2021, the supply response would have taken 5 or 6 years to get online. In other areas, California, not an exception, but um, particularly in the Southeast, in markets with very, very low barriers to entry, markets like Savannah, Georgia, for example, the ability to respond to spikes in demand was almost immediate. You could get a piece of land and get it entitled and start building it within 3 or 4 months. So when there was, 10 tenants competing over every 200,000 foot space, markets like that did get oversupplied very quickly. The ability to stop a project is kind of the same no matter where you are. No one's telling you have to go. So we saw a lot of that in New Jersey, especially over the last 2 years, where there was projects that we anticipated might get built on spec in 2025, that simply just the owner decided to keep it as vacant land and preserve their entitlements to fight another day, but they're not building it. So the amount of deliveries of new spec industrial space in New Jersey for 25 versus 24 was about a third, and between 23 and 24 it was about a half. So we are way down from the peak of development deliveries, and that has really helped keep that vacancy recovery rate on a healthy trajectory. Some of those projects that press pause, this year or last year, might never get built. But a good number of them will. They're just waiting for either the vacancy rate to recover to a certain point or rents to start demonstrating that they're going to start growing at a certain rate again to build that speculative. And we're no exception. We have several sites that we would have liked to release on spec in 25, but market conditions really didn't allow us to do that. So we're hoping to either start this year or early next year on those projects.
It really would be a gift and a curse having that long of a development cycle, as you mentioned, where if Savannah can turn around things in months, and other markets as well, Savannah wouldn't be the only one, but many markets can turn around things in months, you do run the risk of significantly overbuilding, even though you're meeting the demand that's there right now. So it's opportunistic, but it also carries a risk, whereas it sounds like it can take you almost a full mini business cycle before you're actually even getting entitlement to develop in there, which it pros and cons, like you mentioned. With that in mind, though, this actually leads to an interesting topic is how do you decide what to build if you're not able to capitalize on those short-term trends, being whether it's everything transitioning to e-commerce really quickly and everybody needing warehouse space. So logistics space would have went crazy in 2020, 21. How do you decide what to build when your ability to respond to short-term trends isn't as easy as it would be in other markets? How do you decide what you're actually going to build?
It's a very astute question because it does definitely impact the way that we design sites. Um, First off, you cannot really afford to cut corners on quality, um, because land is extraordinarily expensive here. And when you factor in the time it takes to get it approved, the expense goes up from there. Um, so if you're going to spend that much money on a piece of land and you're going to spend that much time and effort on an entitlement, you want an asset that's going to last a very, very long time and that is going to be, appealing to the widest universe of tenants. And that's really where it impacts design, and where it also tells a bit of a story about some of the elevated vacancy that we've seen over the last 2 years. So let me dive into that a little bit. we like to make sure that our dock ratios are as close to perfect as possible, that we have a lot of excess trailer parking on the site, excess car parking. And often we will sacrifice potential additional rentable square footage to add those amenities to a site plan. It's something that we've always felt is very important. We are at our core long-term owners. And so we want, the assets that we build to last for 50 to 100 years. We're less concerned about the immediate residual value once we finish and lease it. Um, so we've always taken a much longer term approach to the design and build process. And that's where this has a little bit to do with the vacancy rate. During the peak of the euphoria, for lack of a better word, um, there was a lot of developers in our area that were not using that strategy because there were so many tenants in the market and um, lease rates were growing so quickly. Instead of building what I would call kind of the perfect spec logistics building, some landlords traded off some of those amenities for additional rentable square footage in their plans. And that made the buildings just a little bit less flexible. Maybe they're harder to divide down to smaller units. Maybe there's not the parking counts that all all the tenants would require. And in some cases, maybe the shape of the building itself just doesn't work ideally for the distribution operation that they're trying to attract. In some ways, particularly in 2022, when we were seeing really peak land pricing, that was one of the only ways that you could be active in the market is by stretching your yield on that site. Otherwise, you just were not going to be able to pay the number that somebody else would be willing to pay for that land. So there was, kind of a moment in time where in order to continue to buy sites and be an active developer in this state, you had to kind of sacrifice some of that design criteria. I could say for me personally, that was a very frustrating period of time because, like I said, we really do believe in this market long term. So being outcompeted by people that we thought were doing something somewhat irresponsible in their design was very frustrating on sites that we think are very, very good investments. Um, what's happened though is the folks that did make those sacrifices are having a much, much harder time leasing out those buildings than the ones that kind of stuck to their design principles. Um, and if you dive into the vacancy rate, especially right now, you'll see what's left to lease, especially in the newer Class A category. They're not perfect assets. They have some drawbacks in terms of their design. Some of the issues I discussed earlier. Um, and I think that the biggest limiting factor for a lot of these things is a lot of these developers didn't think about dividing the building into smaller units up front. Um, Most institutional investors really like a big bomber with a single tenant execution. So that's kind of what they designed a lot of these buildings to accommodate. But over the last 2 years, that has not been in demand. The demand segment for the tenants in the market is much smaller. It's 50 to 300,000 feet, not 500 to 1 million square feet. So if you have an 800 or 1 million square foot building that you didn't design in a way that can divide into smaller units, you're kind of stuck without anyone interested in leasing it right now. If you did stick to those design principles and you have the parking laid out in a way where the building can be split into smaller units, those leases are still getting done and those landlords are living to fight another day. It's really those projects that made some trade-offs in the design to make the site make sense financially that are struggling the most right now.
That's such a brilliant observation. And I think it underscores one of the weaknesses and maybe even inaccuracies when quoting a vacancy rate is that the vacancy rate is an aggregate rate. That includes everything. It can include a 40-year-old building that's 1 million square feet that's been vacant because it has low ceiling heights and poor loading. But it also includes all the modern buildings where a developer, as you mentioned, stretched it to maybe add an extra 50,000 square feet to buildable area when that could have been used for more marshaling area or yard storage or parking or anything. That all gets grouped into the overall vacancy rate, where when you're almost comparing apples to oranges, as strange as that is to say, because they are still industrial buildings. They look very similar. People from the outside would think that they function very similar, but there is a huge difference between that that perfect industrial building and one that was optimized for rent. So I think that is such a great observation, and for anyone that's studying the industrial market, I think that that's such an astute thing to realize, is that the vacancy rate is broad, and even market rental rates is broad. You really need to drill down and compare, what does this building look like compared to this other building, and are they actually comparable, or was one stretched to the limit just to get the most amount of rent that they can? Very well explained on that. That was an awesome overview, and I think people really should take that to heart when they're looking at industrial buildings.
I not to go down a rabbit hole there, but it is part of the part of what attracted me to real estate in the first place was that exactly, that it is not a commodity, despite it sometimes being described that way. Especially industrial real estate is often described as a commodity asset class. No, real estate is, right, and I think that's what makes this industry so fun, and you always have to be learning here, because every piece of land has its own characteristics and every building has its own history. There's never perfect comparables, and understanding those subtleties between how a building was built and the leasing strategy and the ownership, that is part of what makes real estate kind of perpetually interesting. There's always more to learn.
And that's why real estate junkies like us never quit, is because it's a puzzle. And the day you stop doing puzzles or trying to learn things or get an edge, I think that's the day you die. So I think I think you have to keep doing this all along. Could we dive into what makes that perfect building a little bit more, if you're comfortable even just describing some of the specs? And maybe we could even do a theoretical one. If you were to buy a 10-acre site in an area that you really like, how you'd go through the thought process of what building goes on there, what do the ceiling heads look like, what dimensions do we have this in? Would you have that top of mind, or even if it's not detailed, but just high level? This is, I think, how we'd put the building on here. Here's how we'd develop it. Here's the ratio of dock and grade doors and parking. I think that'd be an interesting experiment if you're up for it.
Sure. Um, and I'll pre-note here that I have a team of people around me that assist in figuring all this out. So it's never just me staring at a site and saying what could be here. There's a large team here around me that all have different skill sets that weigh in on this. But um, a 10-acre site, pretty small for us for an industrial use. We would start by really analyzing the location, right? Where is this? What surrounds it? What's the access to the major logistical networks in the state? In New Jersey, it's the turnpike is really the artery of the state, as well as a few other major highway networks. So looking at where it is and what types of tenants are in that market will drive some of the design decisions, and it will drive some of the business plan decisions as well for that site. Is this a site that we should be building speculatively on, or is this a site that we can kind of land bank and reserve for a build to suit? That will be both dictated by the price we have to pay to acquire the land, as well as the zoning, the approval process, and its location in context with what's around it. So we kind of start there, and then we get into the specifics of the site itself. So, we always need kind of the starting point as a survey of the land to understand what's there. We often will run into, where are the wetlands? How are they delineated? Are they delineated? And what types of processes do we have to go through to perfect any sort of identification on the survey of either wetlands or underground utility easements, or, as you can imagine, in a state with as much history as New Jersey, every piece of land has a history, even if it's farmland. Which honestly, there's not a lot of farmland being developed in the state. Most of the projects that we participate in and are available to participate in the market are redevelopments. So there's always some history there. So So once we figure out kind of what the buildable highlands are on the site, where we can build in relation to wetlands if there are any, we look at the zoning, we look at the setbacks, we look at what the permitted uses are, and we understand if there's any sort of changes to that zoning that we would need in order to build the project that we want to build. Often at this point, we'll kind of figure out if there's something called the redevelopment process here in New Jersey that kind of allows you to sign what's called a redevelopment agreement with the town, and that allows you to get a little bit more flexibility on the uses and the zoning within that property. It also permits you to apply for a payment in lieu of taxes pilot, basically a tax discount on your property taxes for that site. So a redevelopment plan is a tool that we use sometimes when the zoning doesn't perfectly line up with the building that we want to build there, and the township is willing to engage with us, and maybe wants to give the project a pilot. We might at that point elect to say this is going to be a redevelopment project. We're going to go through the redevelopment process. The redevelopment process adds anywhere from 6 to 12 months to your overall entitlement process, so it comes with a trade-off, but sometimes that's the right direction to take on a site plan application, rather than trying to get a variance approved or get the underlying zoning changed. It can be faster sometimes. It can come with other advantages. So now we've got, a piece of land where we understand roughly where we can build and how long, what the process is with the local government to get that approved. We now go and draw a concept plan. So we'll take the survey. We do that in-house. We got a couple guys that are very good at visualizing sites, and we see what we can build there. We usually iterate that, I would say, anywhere from 5 to 25 times on any individual site. Those iterations might be because we look at it and say, we can do better. We can get more parking. We can get a slightly larger building. We can get the circulation better. So we iterate design to get the design better. We also iterate it for different types of uses. And we specialize in a few types of, subsets of the industrial world. I'd say we do a lot of business with pharmaceutical companies. We build out a lot of that space, and we have developed a specialty in analyzing and building cold chain supply, so freezer buildings and refrigerated buildings. Those are, particularly in the freezer side, that's a much more specialized use and requires a kind of decision up front as to whether that's kind of the plan you want to pursue on that site. So there are certain sites that are better suited for cold than others. It's shape, size, location. And sometimes this would be the point in the process where we'd say, this is perfect for cold storage. We're going to call all of our cold storage contacts and see if they have interest. Otherwise, the concept plan is the best spec building we can build. Like I said, it's the building that has as many features as possible. And those features would include car parking. The more, the better. But also how it's distributed across the site and how it is accessed the building itself. So just putting a large remote parking lot on one side of the building, that is, even if it has more spaces than you need, it might not be the ideal design, because like I was talking about earlier, this concept of being able to split the building up to multiple tenants in the future, you probably want some of that parking distributed around the site so that you can have multiple tenants using it. The way that trucks ingress and egress from the site, super important to our tenants. So we look at, how a truck will get from the road to the door, and what they're going to have to interact with on the way. We like keeping our trucks and cars separate as much as possible. And so do our tenants. But we also need to consider planning for queuing, because trucks, sometimes there's an inspection process or a guard shack or something that trucks have to go to. So we need to take into account how many trucks do we think will come to this building? How much room would they need, so that they're not causing a traffic jam on the street when they're coming in and out of the facility. And then within the building itself, we have a pretty standardized set of specs for our buildings. It's something that we're constantly changing and updating based on feedback that we get on buildings we've already built or trends that we see overall in the market. So, we have a certain floor spec that we use that's probably been updated 8 times in the last 10 years, just based on new materials, new technology, and new requirements from tenants. So while I like the quote from Mark Andreessen. I quote it all the time. He says, strong opinions loosely held, and that's kind of our design criteria. We do have very strong opinions on what should be built and what works best for these types of buildings, but we don't hold them sacred because it does change pretty rapidly and pretty consistently, and we like to stay up to date with those changes.
Yeah, great point. I loved how you started that by saying that there's a lot of thought process and a lot of experts that weigh in on this beyond just one person waving a wand and saying this is what's going to get built here. Let's make it happen. It's is as simple as some people might think industrial real estate is, the proverbial four walls and a roof. It is so much more sophisticated and nuanced than trying to level it down to that basic. There is a lot that goes into it. So I think that is a really important thing to highlight, is it's not just one person that's doing this. And if it is one person doing it, that's where there's a lot of blind spots, and there's a lot of
Yeah.
missed opportunity to have input from other people that are experts in those fields. Uh,
Yep.
how would you say, like, what's the optimal building right now in New Jersey? Is there a desired ceiling height? Is it 40 feet? Is it higher than that now? What, how many dock doors are you seeing? Is there a ratio? Any kind of rules of thumb, I suppose, on what makes an optimal building right now?
You want to get really nerdy.
I
Okay,
do.
let's
I
get
do.
really nerdy. Yeah, first off, just the headline is more pretty much, when it comes to these not in terms of square footage, but amenities. And mainly amenities for industrial are parking. Parking and power are kind of the two big ones. So the most in demand size segment, it changes month to month, and it's been pretty volatile. But the perfect size building, I'd say right now, is anywhere from 75,000 feet to 200,000 feet. That's where we're seeing the bulk of demand. That's where we're seeing the bulk of the size of the requirements. And we have noticed over the last, say, 3 months or so that that's growing in size. So I mentioned earlier in the conversation that big bomber requirements have been roughly, entirely out of the market for the last 18 months. We do see some pretty good early indications that that's changing and they're coming back to the market now. So my answer to this question might be stale by the time you publish this, and that wouldn't be that unusual considering how much change has occurred in the industrial space over the last 5 years. The ability to divide, I'd say, is really important. I keep coming back to that, but when we're thinking about investing in real estate, the flexibility is really, really important to a long-term business plan. So, even if we built a 300,000 or 400,000 foot building today, we would want to feel comfortable that we can at least split that building in half, ideally into 3 or 4 different tenants if we need to. Um, and to stay alive right now to get those buildings leased, occupancy is kind of everything over the last 12 months. If you don't have the flexibility to take occupancy where you can get it, I think that is probably the most important design criteria most recently from a landlord perspective. In terms of what tenants desire, parking counts, obviously the right doors in the right places with the right design. I'd say the market has gotten a lot better about the depth of truck courts and adding trailer parking to plans, but there's still a need for more of that, particularly on trailer parking. Um, and electrical service has become increasingly important. It's been in the news a lot around data centers, and New Jersey has experienced some price hikes over the last 12 months. A big part of our current governor's campaign was to freeze energy pricing. Um, but the truth is here, look, data centers do draw a lot of power, but all of our uses are drawing more power today than they were 5 years ago, and significantly more, particularly for new requirements. Um, the amount of automation that goes into these spaces requires a lot of electricity, a lot more than they previously needed. And there's more electrical load just for a basic distribution requirement than there ever has been. So all of these uses are drawing more electricity, and we're seeing it be much more common for what we advertise as available in a building not being enough. So if we advertise 4,000 amps of power available, which is pretty standard for an industrial building, we're still seeing a lot of requirements come in and say, I need 8 or 12 or 15. 4 is not going to cut it. And that seems to be one of the things that is driving requirements to certain locations where that's available that really wasn't a huge consideration, say 6 or 7 years ago.
Yeah, and looking back, even 6, 7 years ago, a warehouse was very simple from a operational standpoint, or at least the load factor, because you had lights, probably had a few propane powered forklifts, and that was it. You didn't really have much beyond that. But now with the picking technology, and it's probably an electric forklift and automation and mechanics, so all of a sudden it's gone from being a very low power requirement to now significantly higher. And then if you look back 40 years, some of these buildings, not only do they have very limited power for today's standards, but they don't even have the availability to bring in more power, or just be so prohibitively expensive. It just doesn't make sense. So I think that's another reason why you're going to have that bifurcation of industrial properties, of that older industrial stock almost needs to be categorized separately. It's almost a different asset class of a 40-year-old industrial building compared to a modern one today, once you factor in twice as high ceiling heights and way better loading areas and marshaling areas and trailer parking and everything. It's just they're so different now that at some point it's going to need to be broken down to identify that, instead of going back to that earlier comment of grouping it all into one vacancy rate or one market rate. So I think that that's going to be something to watch going forward. You'll be able to
Yeah,
explain.
and an interesting stat on that. Sorry to cut you off, but
No problem.
I think the widely accepted kind of industry standard is that your industrial buildings should last about 50 years. And after 50 years, it's kind of functionally obsolete. It no longer really works as what it was built for. And so a lot of people will look at certain markets and say, the average age of the industrial stock is X. There's a big wave of redevelopment that's coming to this market. New Jersey's average industrial age is about 56, 57 right now. So we're well over that kind of industry accepted functional obsolescence state with the majority of the industrial stock in the state. And that's pretty remarkable when you consider how much has been built over the last 10 years and how much stock we've added. Still a majority of it is too old to be functional. But one of the remarkable things, particularly in really tight markets like around the Port of Newark, it doesn't matter to some of these tenants. They will lease less than ideal space because that is what is available and that's what works for them. So in other markets, something that's 40 or 50 years old is probably going to stay vacant for a very long time and be very hard to lease. If you're in the right location and you got, just tick one of, say, 10 boxes, there's a good chance you can find a tenant to keep that space leased long after it would be considered functionally obsolete in most other markets in the country. So it's an interesting dynamic here, where it also makes it harder to justify redevelopment of these old assets too. Well, it's a 55-year-old building, but there's a tenant in there who's paying $15 in rent. So how can you possibly knock it down and build Class A if someone's still willing to lease this? Constant point of analysis we do on our redevelopment projects is, this looks terrible and it doesn't look functional, but there's people that want to lease it nonetheless.
Yeah, it's similar to multifamily. If hard to demolish an old building and put up a new one if there's tenants that are paying rent for it, and that all has to get factored into the equation versus just an empty building that nobody wants. So I think that is very important. We're coming up out of time. There's still a few things I want to cover though. One, just real quickly, you'll do a better job of describing this than I would, but with that million square foot building, just using a hypothetical number that was designed for a single tenant, why is it so difficult to take that million square foot building and demise it into five 200,000 square foot bays?
So most million footers are crosstalked, and that's kind of standard design, meaning there's loading on two sides of the building, um, which means that you're often limited if you're trying to adhere to really good design standards to putting car parking on really just the ends of the building, um, because you don't want to mix your car parking and your trailer parking. It creates a safety hazard and an operational headache for the tenants. As I was discussing previously, it's not just the number of parking, but it's how it's situated in relation to the building. A lot of the times, if you just have parking on either end of the building, you're going to be somewhat limited in how you can divide that space, because most employers want their employees parking right outside of where they're coming into the building. They don't want them traversing a lot of parking lot. They don't want them in a remote lot somewhere. Remember, these are very large buildings. So parking on one side and walking to the other, while that might not be a big deal in most office buildings, that could be half a mile in an industrial building. And that's, that takes time away from their work productivity. Um, so particularly with the really big crosstalk bombers, it is hard to design flexibility into those spaces. Um, when you're splitting a crosstalk, you typically want to keep the units that you're splitting into crosstalked. So you can only really split the building vertically, so to speak. We have seen plenty of landlords split a crosstalk down the middle in what I call a four quarters divide, where they're taking a crosstalk and they're really making it into four different single side load buildings with a division wall down the middle of the building. Um, to me, that's far from an ideal business plan, because a crosstalk has its own value. It has its own logistical uh, justification for having a crosstalk. So when you take a crosstalk building and you kind of neuter it into a single side load asset, you're giving up an amenity that you planned for in that building, and you're probably lessening its value by dividing it that way. Um, so these are hard to plan for. But one thing that we've done in some of the really large format buildings that we've designed, particularly the crosstalks, is we've left ourselves the flexibility to convert one side of the building into car parking. And instead of building it out as truck loading, we preserve design flexibility to be able to convert that into a massive field of car parking. That really played in our favor on a project a few years ago. We decided to build a 1.1 million square foot building speculatively in Logan Township in New Jersey. We had started the work. Target came along and wanted to lease the building after we were about 3 months into the build. So pretty early on, but they didn't need our crosstalk design, and they needed, almost 400 additional car parking spaces than what we had provided in the spec plan. So we were able, with a pretty short pause, we paused construction for about a month, redesigned the site, reapproved the site, and we're able to add all that parking by basically replacing loading doors with car parking spaces. Um, so we were able to land, an extremely sought after tenant in that building, because we had both taken the risk of starting a spec so we could deliver it pretty quickly, but we had also left ourselves the flexibility to, kind of amend that design around the edges to accommodate some specialty use. And that's the kind of business plan flexibility that we think is really important at Greek, and we really try to inject into as much of our projects as we can.
Yeah, I think it's so prudent and wise. Uh, Two things that I've taken from this, and I hope others have tuned in and really paid attention to this, is parking and flexibility. And while those might sound obvious, in my experience, they're often an afterthought where it's like, oh, yeah, this tenant's going to want a lot of parking. And we didn't really prepare for that because we were so focused on ceiling heights or whatever it was. And not to say that that's not important either, but parking should be in that conversation right from the beginning, because there's too many times that that's an afterthought. So not having that flexibility approach to it at the beginning can be detrimental if you do have an opportunity come along like you guys did and landing a great tenant. Not having that flexibility and not having that forethought of saying this is going to be important, I think is imperative. And I think that's just very well said on how you described that. So I hope people really paid attention to that. I'm very respectful of your time, and I know we're already over. I could talk to you for another 5 hours, by the way. Like I could take the rest of the day off and just ask you questions, but
Me too. I can talk endlessly on this if you can't tell. So
well,
happy to do another session at some point in the future if we run out of time today.
we're gonna one. That's what I was gonna suggest next is we have to do it, because I could ask questions on cold storage. There's so many different directions we could take this, so we will definitely have to do a second episode. But I know you wanted to discuss an initiative that you're part of as well. I'll leave it to you to tee that up and describe it however you like.
Thank you. Appreciate you circling back to this. So I've been a member of NIOP for a long time, and actually, I just recently discovered that my father is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, NIOP member in the country. He's been a member of NIOP for over 50 years, so he
Wow.
was kind of one of the founding members here in New Jersey, and he's still very active in the organization, even at 86. So I'm very proud to be part of that organization, and this is I've been deeply involved with our Developers Political Action Committee here in New Jersey for a long time. That's through NIOP. That's their kind of lobbying part of what they do. About 5 years ago, I noticed that we discussed policy during those DPAC sessions, but we were spending about half, if not more, of the time just kind of as a therapy session with our fellow developers, saying, you know, the amount of pushback we're getting from the public, it's like it's never been before. Their capability to organize, to spread misinformation, it's grown so exponentially. And us as real estate owners and developers have done almost nothing to try and protect ourselves against it, to try and at least balance the narrative. Um, so I kind of raised my hand 2 years ago and said, I'd like to try something. I'd like to put together a coalition of both real estate owners, logistics operators, truckers, port operators, everyone involved in the supply chain, um, and have us start trying to balance this narrative. Have us start trying to show the world that we are not evil. We add a lot of value to the economy, and really everyone interacts with the industrial world, even if you're not aware of it. And that formed into something called Circulate New Jersey. Um, we've managed to pull together a really diverse coalition of people to cooperate and help us fund this initiative. It includes major tenants, major landlords, trucking associations, individual trucking companies, as well as major people from the port. And what it's focused on is really trying to show the good side of both industrial development and logistics operations. Um, there was a couple times during this conversation itself where a lot of what happens in the industrial world is out of sight. And some people even in the industry don't see everything that happens because it happens behind walls or it happens on a rooftop. And that's something I've felt for a while. And I think, the last couple of years have proved me correct that we need to do more work as an industry to broadcast, because we do a lot of good. And we bring a lot of value, but oftentimes that's behind the scenes or out of sight of the public, and all they see is more trucks on the street or more industrial buildings around the corner from them. And as you said up front, industrial's never particularly been a popular asset class, not with investors and certainly not with the public for the past 30 years. While it's gained popularity with investors, it has not gained popularity with the public over the last 10 years. While groups like Amazon have taken a lot of space, they're highly visible. And, when a problem occurs, it gets magnified by the media 1,000 times. We've also been experiencing a lot of misinformation from well-intentioned groups, but often, the environmental protection groups can really spin facts in a way that is misleading, particularly when it comes to real estate development. And one of the things, in that category, one of the things that Circulate has, I think, effectively and continues to effectively highlight is in New Jersey, the amount of environmental remediation that occurs because of industrial development. It is really one of the main tools that this state uses to take contaminated sites and clean them up is by having a guy like me come in, clean the site up, and build an industrial building on top of it to encapsulate whatever's left there. Um, Industrial development is really responsible for a huge amount of environmental cleanup in the state. Yet, if you read the papers, we're responsible for the pollution. And it's just, it doesn't line up with reality. So we've been pretty effective, and I've been somewhat surprised by how much influence we've been able to have with very little resources and very little actual capital spent on paid advertising. Most of the media we get is earned. We simply put out as much good factual information about the industry as possible. We partnered with Rutgers and NIOP last year to help fund and coordinate a study of kind of the overall industrial presence in New Jersey, and I'm glad we did. That study showed that what we all knew in the industry, but we needed numbers to prove it. Over $1 billion in New Jersey's GDP is originated from the industrial industry. Over 1.3 million jobs directly or indirectly supported by the industrial industry. These are huge numbers. It highlights how important this industry is to this area, and also just how broad its impact is, how many people it affects, how much of the economy it drives. And we've been broadcasting those numbers from the rooftops, and you'll continue to see us broadcast them throughout this year. This, I think, is illustrative of Circulate's approach. We're using facts. We're not spinning. We're not using some of the tools that our opposition uses against us, which is misinformation. We just want to correct the record to show that, factually speaking, there's a lot of good that this industry brings. And like I said, it's the tone has noticeably shifted here in the media in particular. We are no longer the universal villains. And I can't give Circulate 100% credit for that. There's a lot of other factors that go into public perception. But we definitely played a big role in it. And I'm very proud of the progress that we made. It's a never-ending fight, though. This is something that we need to continue to focus on as an industry. I'm hoping that Circulate can provide a model for other states to try and do something similar, because this is not a problem that is, specific to New Jersey. NIMBYs live everywhere and they're spreading out. So we need to find a way to really correct the record, and Circulate's helping do that. Thank you for allowing me to talk about that.
I'm glad you brought that up, and I applaud you for taking the initiative and congratulate you on the success you've had. I think that it's so appropriate given the pushback that we're seeing all across the world for industrial, of moratoriums and communities organizing to oppose a data center, or they don't want a distribution center. It's only picking up steam. And I think as an industry, we're great at communicating with ourselves. There's great conferences, and there's a lot of great resources, and we're really good at talking amongst ourselves within the industry, but we're not good at saying, here's all the things that on how it helps everybody. Like yes, it's great and we love it and we're passionate about it, but here's why it should be of interest to you. And at the very least, here's why you shouldn't be pushing back or spreading misinformation at the worst. So yeah, I'm glad you guys are
Amen.
working on a template for that, because this should be a nationwide initiative, because there's certainly other areas that are feeling this pushback as well. When there is the other side of the story, and the narrative is always bigger than just the pushback. But if we don't do anything beyond just accepting it and saying, well, all these groups are mad and we just have to accept it, and even if they're lying and incorrect on it, we're just going to have to take it because that's what we've resigned ourselves to. That's not the case. There is an opportunity to at least say, here's all the good that it's doing. So yeah, really applaud you on taking that initiative, and great to hear that you're having some success on that, and hopefully
Thank you.
other people can take this on and roll it out in other markets as well, because there is a tremendous amount that the industry feeds to the economy and people at large. So we do need to sing that more from the rooftops, instead of just uh, hoping that people understand it when really they don't. So yeah, awesome on that. We could chat more about that as well in a future episode. We'll definitely have to do a second one. I'll tee that up with you offline for another one. But in the meantime, if someone wanted to reach out to you, I'll put more information in the show notes, or why it will help me compile this. But we'll put information to Greek's website, LinkedIn. I want to look into that Circulate New Jersey more, so we'll include something on that. But if someone wanted to reach out to you, more information, is there a preferred way that you want, if people want to reach out?
You can find me pretty easily on our website or on LinkedIn or really anywhere. I encourage you to take a look at Circulate New Jersey's Instagram page. We're very active there. There's some fun things on there. There's some serious things on there. We do a few memes occasionally, so that's a fun page to follow. And Greek REP on Instagram as well. We're very active there. Share progress on our projects as well as highlight, some key staff members. So find us there. And I'm always open for another chat when you're ready for episode 2.
Love it. We'll include all those in the show notes, and we are unquestionably doing episode number 2 in the near future. So stay tuned to that. But yeah, thank you so much for this. This was absolutely fantastic. Like I said, I could talk to you for another 5 hours. So we'll cut it short for today, but we will definitely pick this up. But thank you for all the insights and the great conversation.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks everybody. Have a great day and stay tuned for part 2.